G'day everyone, welcome back to the Talking Leadership podcast series. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on the leadership question and very much focus on the issue of communication. Now, my guest today is the founder and managing director of Unitive Consulting. Can I welcome to the podcast, Joe Ringer? How are you, mate?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Mate, thank you for coming along. So before we do get started, a bit of background on you, why the area of consulting and education and marketing as part of what you do, why that as an industry sector to be working in?
I kind of grew into it through a variety of different roles. In my corporate career, did a variety of roles across the spectrum, and kind of really more gravitated to leadership, change, those sort of factors of business and organisations that require humans to interact and work together well.
Understanding the human being in the workplace, mate, that's an ongoing challenge. So let's start at question one, if we could then, Joe. Leader communication. Give me a sense of the good, the bad, and the ugly from your perspective.
It's a good question to start with, and I think it can take us down a variety of different paths. But, for me, some of the top aspects of good communication from a leadership perspective is, transparency, I think is one of those. Definitely working, change is constant. It's always around us, right, in our organizations. And that quote's probably been done to death, but the only constant in life is change, but it still, holds true. And I think that, previous efforts around driving change, whether it's organizational transformation or restructures or, M&A or whatever it might be that you're trying to achieve as an organization or with your teams, there's tended to be like a very hierarchical top-down approach to communication, or at least it was, 80s, 90s, and then started changing as we sort of moved into the new millennia. And so transparency is always key, I think, because humans, smell BS, right? They know when a leader is not being authentic, and you and your listeners have probably heard a lot of the work of Brene Brown as well, and her work on, vulnerability. And I think that's really critical and timely for, where we're at in terms of developing our sort of understanding of leadership and our understanding of leadership culture. So they're kind of some key things there. I could call out a few others, but does that kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, it does, mate. So as part of the podcast process, as much as I'm helping the discussion to progress, which is my job, I'm trying to learn from those that I'm talking to, and communication often comes up as part of the process for more effective leadership. And I am still on the fence with regard to ranking the importance of communications as a core leader capability, because I don't think you can escape that. But I also look at things like strategic thinking and foresight as other critical leader capabilities. And if I'm being fair income about what I'm hearing from my guests, I think these things meld together in a way that they're all reliant on each other to get more effective leadership. So someone with a vision and an ability to map out a roadmap to get there, whatever that looks like, if they can't communicate that, then you're not going to get people buying onto the vision of where you need to go. But at the same time, you could be the best speaker in the world, but if you don't have a direction, then you're not going to go anywhere either. So I think there's a level of mutual dependence on some of these capabilities. So it very much strikes true for me what you're saying, and this idea that we're experiencing continual change is something we can't escape. And it's something I'd like to talk to you about when we get to the question around COVID. But I'd maybe throw something back to you as a bit more of a deep dive into this first question, if I could, mate. Appetite for ambiguity and how you communicate. How does communication play a role when you're dealing with ambiguity? And do you see a link between the two and potentially with the leader function?
Yeah, 100%. So back to what you were saying there, firstly, about them being, interrelated. I don't kind of hold a view that, there's one leadership competence that outranks another, and it's they mutually dependent in many, different contexts. So it's not like you've got a nice competency hierarchy and it's all laid out in the spreadsheet. We see those, we've all got those models in our organization, and they're important and they serve their purpose, but it's a little bit more complex than that in the actual day to day. So back to, ambiguity and communication. So dealing with ambiguity as a key competence of a leader, absolutely. That is increasingly so in, a world that is accelerating in its shifts and changes, and, how our organizations are needing to adapt to it. You've probably heard other guests talk about the VUCA model, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, that model that's come from the originated from the US Defense Force. But this communication really comes back to the heart. When it comes to ambiguity, it ties in again with transparency and vulnerability, because sometimes you're not going to have all the answers. So gone are the days where the leader needs to have all the answers, but they have to be able to have that ability to communicate and lead people through the change and lead them through, the dark places, the confusing places, the parts that we don't have the full picture yet, right? And so there's a kind of a dance that goes with that, so to speak, in terms of knowing when it's the right time to be more directive in your communication and knowing when it's time to be more collaborative. And so that really comes down to sort of, learning to communicate as a leader. And I think that ties a lot to self-awareness, really, and being present. Strategic thinking is critically important, but it's the implementation of that strategy in the day-to-day that, really is where the rubber hits the road. I see loads of organizations and with great plans, and, but then those plans just sit there, and you look back a year later or 2 years later, and what did we do about those? Well, we really didn't, execute on those like we said we were going to.
Yeah, agreed. I think what I know that I'm seeing, at least in the professional circles that I work in, that often strategic thinking is confused for strategic planning. The two are very different functions. One is a leader capability, and the other is a process to get from A to B and C and beyond. And I think the pitfalls of doing, for example, strategic planning wrong is understanding that communication needs to be embedded in that process, because you need to tell people where you're going, and not only as a roadmap, but this idea about taking people with you. And I've heard that quite a bit, and being present for them when things go wrong is all based on how you communicate what it is that your values are and where you think you need to go. And I'm glad you mentioned, because I haven't heard it a lot, is the picking your time and knowing, and this is, I guess, the art of being an effective leader, is picking when you're directive and picking when you want to get collaboration or some other form of movement amongst your teams, as an example. And you set up, Joe, a good segue into the next question around communication as a fundamental leadership skill. So I know before you said it's hard to rank them, but do you think it's up there? If there was an up there, that it's up there as one of the key ones?
Without good communication, I think your efforts as a leader would definitely slow, and I think you run high levels of risk around disengagement, satisfaction, performance of your team, or those that you're leading. And I think that's true whether that's just communicating internally, but then also with external stakeholders as well, whether that's with other organizations or community stakeholders, whether it's partners, etc. So this communications ecosystem as a leader has become even more complex as we start to recognize, as organizations, our broader corporate social responsibilities and environmental responsibilities, and responsibilities to our workers. A lot of organizations are starting to really explore this idea of creating profit, but doing that in a sustainable way, and balancing profit, people, and planet. And so if you kind of think about that model, then the skills of communication become even more important, because it's not just your communication to your direct reports or your team. It's about this ecosystem that's basically making the organization successful or functioning or not healthy in the if you're looking at it in the negative.
This is why I like the podcasting process. So I'll try and do a bit of a deeper dive into comms being a critical leader skill set to have. Now you work in that's, for me, that strange world of consulting. You're out there doing stuff with organizations, and without naming a particular organization. Do you find that part of any issue that you might encounter has a communications element to it that's potentially gone awry? Not necessarily wrong communication, because that's subjective, but just comms that have either not existed, or there's some break in that system that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, 100%. Most of our clients are, large technology vendors or service providers, etc. And, they all have their own cultures, which you're communicating. But, let's just take, for example, a consulting project. If we haven't scoped things properly at the beginning, that's a communications activity in terms of alignment of, expectations, understanding, and all of those attributes. It's not just a one-way piece. And so that reminds me, really, this communication is always iterative, and it's a process, and it's evolving. And so getting that alignment of understanding expectations, making sure we're on the same page, really is kind of the starting point for the work that we do, and then supporting that process. So, linking back to what you were saying before about the difference between strategic planning and strategic intent, even the planning processes in organizations are having to change when it comes to strategy, because they used to be very, top down oriented, and now they're becoming much more agile and iterative themselves, so they can adapt more quickly. And I think this is the evolving nature of our understanding of communication. It's not just about the words we speak and how we say it, or the techniques that we use. It's really just about, how we're showing up and engaging and interacting in the workplace.
Couldn't agree more with that. I guess one question that I have for you from your experiences in that work environment, and this comes from some wisdom that's been imparted to me from previous guests and my own travels around the joint, is that if you're going to be a more effective communicator, now shoot me down if you don't agree, because the purpose of the discussion here is that you should be doing more listening than talking if you're really going to get to the nub of issues, that you've got two ears and one mouth for a reason, and that you should be listening more intently. And so the second part of the question is, well, first part being, do we listen to the degree that we need to, or as much as we need to? And do you believe that the skill of being a good active listener is not something that is naturally gifted to people, that you have to learn to be a good listener?
Yeah, no, I do. I think there's a few dimensions to listening. And I think this is, again, comes back to individual leadership development and self-awareness, that as we become more aware of the things that hold us back, and the way that we're made as an individual, like we're not trying to kind of make robots or anything, but we're trying to become more authentic versions of ourselves, essentially. But as we go through that process, I think we learn the art of letting go of the layers that hold us to a specific point of view, or a specific way of things being in the world, being black or white, or having to be our way. And a lot of us do get trapped, trying to drive a certain outcome and not being present. And I think presence is a really key skill for all of us to practice and learn in terms of leadership communication. I mean, let's take this podcasting process, for example. You could have said to me, Joe, I want to interview you on leadership and communication, and I could do a whole heap of preparation and have all my notes, and then say, I've got to cover this, I've got to do this, I've got to. But if I'm kind of in that zone when you're talking, I'm naturally thinking about what am I saying next? But what I really should be doing is, all right, let's tune into what Eric's saying. Where's this conversation going? Where is it leading us? And then we're going to have a much deeper, more insightful discussion. So I've kind of answered it in a roundabout way, but I think definitely, listening, there's that old truism, right? Two ears, one mouth. But I don't think there's any human or any leader that doesn't struggle to be a better listener in all contexts. I think it's definitely something we can learn.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm not discounting the day-to-day pressures that leaders are under, the day-to-day pressure that teams are under. And I think it's just easier to circumvent good active listening and just get to the nub of something, potentially not taking into account the feelings and issues of the people around you to get an outcome. I think that happens regularly. I think the best and most effective leaders I've ever met, when they make those mistakes, will often come back to the people that they've put undue pressure on and either apologize or make them aware that it wasn't an oversight, it was just human error, and that you've learnt from it. And it's rare, but I've had bosses that have been very apologetic about their behavior and said it's unacceptable, they shouldn't have done it. But it's always after the fact, but at least they're practicing what I think is another skill that definitely has communication at its core, and that's being self-reflective, being able to look at what you do in your practice and then accept some feedback, and not just accept feedback, but actively seek it, will make you a better communicator. Because if you create a space where people feel safe enough to discuss and give you genuine feedback, that's how I think leaders excel in their practice. But you have to be able to, as a leader, also wear the feedback that's coming back, because it's not always going to be pretty. And it's always how you couch it. I mean, if somebody says, give me some feedback, you're not going to go in with a sledgehammer. You try and be diplomatic, but if you're fed income, I think that's the best kind of feedback, at least from my perspective. So interested, Joe. And again, we're making some good links here about what, in your experience, are roadblocks to good communication. So you've been out in the world, you've consulted, you've built your own business. I think from what I've seen of what you do, you straddle the entrepreneur leader dynamics. You're somewhere in the middle there. I think you're doing both, and it'd be interesting wearing the multiple hats that you do to get some sense of what you believe are roadblocks to better communication.
I think just having what we call a beginner's mind. So like continually learning, continually seeing leadership as a growth journey. We talked about also getting comfortable with ambiguity. And then in that leadership journey, I think it's recognizing that it's not just about training the brain. The sort of field of mindset work in leadership has really taken leaps and bounds in the last decade, definitely. But it's off the back of obviously decades of other interesting research. But there's just this general idea now that it's not just about the cognitive, it's around also looking at the neural wiring and how we reprogram all of our habits. And then it's down to also research on how we recognize emotion as leaders and feel that in our body, and all of these sorts of things that typically you wouldn't find yourself talking about in the workplace are becoming more conversations that people and leaders are willing to engage in. I think another aspect would also be, if you're not a good coach as a leader, I think then that's a big roadblock. And I think learning the skills of good coaching is good communication from a leadership standpoint, and the ability to know that that skill allows you to know when to be directive, know when to be collaborative, know how to draw the best out of people by working with their strengths, but then also opening up them for the potential for improvement in certain areas, etc. I think it's a skill that there's been plenty of training programs around for many years, but my observation is lots of people get trained in it, but leaders don't spend enough time actually practicing it. And it's in that practicing of that on a regular basis that you develop this skill that can change your game as a leader, but it can significantly impact in a positive way the people that you're leading.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the coaching. Being a good coach is being a good communicator and hopefully better leader into the future. And of the privilege of being able to talk to a few people that have worked as coaches in that sporting realm. One thing that I'm interested in there, and you've brought it up, so I'll maybe tease this out a little bit in your thinking as well, is when you look at coaches that are coaching A-grade teams like professional athletes, they're no longer coaching and developing physical attributes and making them the best physical specimens for the team. they're coaching to get a team to gel and be coherent. And maybe this is another research PhD for someone, or if it's already, maybe it's already being done, is doing the deep dive into what is good and bad communication in coaching in that team setting with professionals. Because if you've got everything else taken care of as these athletes have been on the come up and they are A-grade athletes, then what is the coach's role other than to get them to be great at being communicators?
Come from a sort of a background where I've not sort of been big in team sports, so it's the more individual sports. But I certainly connect with or understand what you're talking about. But that still plays true in, you know, highest levels of corporate coaching or transition coaching, career coaching, and those types of things. Is essentially what we're looking at there is what are the elements of mindset and how's mindset worked. So when you said that these elite athletes are, you know, they're primed, they're at, you know, physically they're, you know, operating at their peak, but then it's the microsecond decisions, or it's the this or the that's the difference between good and like world class, right? And so a lot of that work, and I do have a friend that you know, does this sorts of team coaching in the A League there. So talking to him, that's where they go, is what are the elements of mindset, both individually and as a team, that are holding them back from next level. And that is an unpacking of, you know, how we make our stories that then form our beliefs, that then drive our behaviors. And then, you know, it's the behaviors that we're looking for that sort of driving the outcome. And so even in an organizational setting, we've done some, you know, work recently with a large client here in Australia that was looking very much at sales performance around mindset and coaching around mindset and taking that to that next level. I think what leaders, you know, my observation in the last couple of years working around this is that leaders are probably a little bit scared to coach. They think that it might open a can of worms, especially if you start to get into the area of mindset, right? Yes, there's considerations there, you know, around appropriateness of, you know, what level you would go to for, you know, obvious reasons around depending on, you know, where your team are at in their own mental health and, you know, the pressure that they're under and all of those types of things. But if you've had permission and engagement from that person to explore those aspects of mindset, they can be the real performance, you know, enhancers when you get to that level, to understand what's stopping you. And so even the coaching that I receive personally, and I invest heavily in coaching for myself, is really learning to see your blind spots, learning to see it from a different perspective, change your narrative, and then have the courage to take the next step to, you know, doing something a little bit differently. And these can be very small changes, or they can be, you know, large scale. But if you've got the right tools and, you know, create that right environment, and good coaching, education and training and learning how to be a coach should teach you that, then you should be able to create a very safe environment where you can go into that territory and it not be too difficult. But I think people are very wary of going there at the moment because they feel unequipped.
Thank you for sharing some really good points, particularly around coaching. It comes up a lot in the more recent discussions I've had on leadership topic areas, and I cover a fair few. But yeah, the leader as a coach, the leader as a mentor, the leader as a teacher, they're all very different. Each has a level of risk, and each also brings a level of trust from the leader to either their team, or trust from the leader in those that are acting in those roles for them. So if you've got a mentor, if you've got a coach, or if you've got someone that's also a coach or mentor / teacher, then you have to have some degree of openness and an ability to change your mind on things. And mindset is an area that I'm not that familiar with, but I'm hearing it a lot more as I go along. And a good percentage of the people that I'm talking to happen to work in the consulting space around leadership, and they're all bring that up in one form or another. And it's interesting to me where that rabbit warren can go in terms of mindset, and how that links to things for me in a practical sense, like what does your leadership practice look like? Is it effective? Is it adaptive? are you only as good a leader as you want to be for that role? And then when you look for another one, it needs to match that. Like, how do you keep, what I'm meaning to say is, how do you keep developing yourself and that drive that some people have to be what I believe is truly lifelong learners versus learners for the sake of it, to fill a gap somewhere, as opposed to being, for example, someone who's prepared to look at the latest literature and research in an area of leadership that they claim expertise in. What's the latest thinking around teams and high performing teams? What's the latest research or practice around mindsets and leadership? Like, I think that kind of approach separates the good from the very good to those who are elite when you're talking about leadership. So yeah, could not disagree with anything that you said there, mate. Now, final question, and this is, I can't escape this. I tried to, but it has to be, I have to ask this. Communication in the pre-COVID and COVID world. Now, this is your area of expertise, so I'm relying on you to draw on that expertise because that's what you have and I don't. So in a few summary sentences, what do you believe that world of leader comms look like pre-COVID, and has COVID now changed anything in your mind, or is it business as usual?
Definitely, it's changed. So pre-COVID, I think the sorts of conversations that we're having, people are trying to look at how to improve leader communication in their organizations. There was a lot more analog, let's say, work, face to face, right? That's the obvious one. And we had to shift very quickly to digital channels. So myself, I was, spending sort of at least 50% of my time in Asia, doing face to face work and all of that. And border controls come down, you can't do that anymore. So what it presented was a way of how do you communicate and engage other humans and collaborate in this digital world. I think the lessons that I've learned and the team have learned through this period is, yes, you can drive much more effective communication than we used to via sort of our digital online models. So, we're using collaborative tool sets to kind of, drive team planning or, team check-ins or stand-ups. Definitely that agile way of working is becoming a lot more prevalent. But I think what I'm observing, and I'm not sure I know exactly the 100% the answer to this, but my observation is that coming off, towards this end of year 2 of COVID, people are sort of testing the water in their organizations about going back into work, mixing sort of hybrid models of, some people on, the phones or, or on Zoom at home or on Microsoft Teams, and then other people in the boardroom at the office or what have you. That is proving very difficult because people that, you need to have a really good facilitator that can then kind of draw the people in out the digital channel and then get them, interacting at the same level of the people in the room. So at the moment, we're kind of playing around with it. Is it either or? If you do it, if you're going to collaborate in that way, everybody is on that sort of digital, channel and working in that way. Or do we make sure that we can do it when we're all available to be together? But, adding to that, I think there's such high levels of disengagement at the moment. There's almost like this, how would I explain it? It's like this general malaise really around, and the volume of change and fatigue. I think there's very low levels of motivation in organizations. People are sort of just very tired after, the last 2 years. And so I think the leader that's aware of that in their team, I think then it's, part of that journey is really, how do I re-engage, recast the vision and paint that vision so that the tools of storytelling and all of those types of communication tools and techniques, they're all, the same. They haven't changed. It's just that we're applying them in different contexts and, ambiguous. Sometimes, you don't know when the next lockdown might be, or you've planned your flight to get the group together in Sydney or Melbourne or wherever it might be. And then, you kind of have this inkling in the back of your mind, well, someone could get sick or they're in lockdown or what have you, and we might have to cancel our plan, a day out or something like that. So I think fundamentally though, that humans are social beings. And there was research done pre-COVID around this from, McKinsey and, others like this, where we're increasing our ways of working in digital ways, but we still need, we function in analog ways as human beings, as and our brains haven't evolved as quickly as the tech is evolving. You know, Moore's law of adoption is like going up exponentially, but our little human brains are sort of like trying to play catch up. And so I think there's going to be some rebalancing. Maybe I don't see it going back 100% to, you know, people traveling as much as they used to. I think there's great benefits in work-life balance and, you know, all of those sorts of things. But certainly that needs to be sort of top of mind in planning, especially strategic communication. And planning is how that looks and how we're going to facilitate that human interaction so that we can re-engage and set direction and get that motivation back to, you know, heading in a direction we're wanting to head.
Joe, you've raised so many cans of worms there. We could keep going on. So many of them. Yeah, I can't find myself disagreeing. I think that argument around all in one way of working or all in a hybrid way of working, I think that discussion is so new and fresh at the moment, that I think there's an underlying potential fear from organizations that if they don't become flexible, they're going to lose key staff or they're going to fail to attract some good people. Now, that I think that's a legitimate fear, but also I think the workforce has clued up that they can still deliver and be good at what they do. They don't necessarily need to be present. Now, that stuff to one side, I don't think, and you made this point, I think it's a great one, we're social creatures. We want to be around other human beings. And the fascinating bit about what you've just raised in my mind is, what are those researchers that looked into team performance now going to do when the function and cohesion of teams has now been influenced to the degree that it has by technology and by a pandemic, where you simply can't leave a region physically. And so you have to go back to plan B. And I think what caught some companies out is we refused to look at a plan B. And when the proverbial started hitting the fan, they just had to do it. And it's a rude awakening. I think it was a rude awakening for some, but in others, I would assume here that in the IT space, that people that work in IT and communications could maybe see this coming and were prepared anyway, because there were systems there like Teams and Zoom and other ways to communicate. I'm making assumptions here, but I would think that those that are working in those areas kind of were prepped for that better than some others. Is that fair call?
Yeah, I definitely think the tech industry was at an advantage moving into COVID from that perspective. Many people have been working in that way already. But probably maybe in the office a little bit more, but it was still a part of the mix. It's a fear, I think, for a lot of organisations. There's certainly, you know, in Australia, there's, you know, a squeeze on talent at the moment in the market, and just trying to attract and retain talent is difficult. But I think that as a leader, you kind of need to be clear on what sort of, you know, behaviors and practices support the culture that you're trying to create. And that's going to be unique to each context and each organization and each team. And so that's part of the leader's job, to sort of decipher and figure out what that mix looks like.
The discussion about what works best in an organization will be unique to that organization. But I think where the approach to what process are you going to undertake to unpack what that looks like, those can be generic enough that organizations of different sizes can say, well, right, what resources do we need to get together to plan what the workspace in the future is going to look like? And unfortunately, there are some industries where this conversation, if I was having this with a nurse, a doctor, a fiery, SES, cop, all critical jobs done by amazing human beings, you can't do them on bloody Zoom. You can't triage someone who's in a car accident and go, let's just join you on Zoom and see what that's not going to happen. So there are, in some contexts, I think the reality of this is, in some occupations, it's never going to be the option of first choice because of the nature of the work. And I think in the manufacturing sector, that is going to play havoc with some systems, because you need some people on a production line, but on others you don't. And I've had some feedback from some discussions with those that have been in that production line logistics game for quite some time, that understanding who is critical to production and who is not so critical is a difficult thing to go through in your mind, but it's something that some bigger organizations have had to deal with. And it's a continual conversation around this thing called communication, that if you don't get that stuff right, people will walk. And it opened my thinking up when you were talking before, Joe, around this idea of that the great resignation, and that people are looking for companies that are prepared to have that chat about what does appropriate work-life balance look like for me, and are you prepared to negotiate what that looks like? Is that something you're hearing, seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that, at a personal level, all of us have been impacted in some way through COVID, and I think for a lot of us that maybe took the time to sit down and take a breather in it somewhere in there, we had a chance or a moment to reflect, and how do we create meaning? What do we want out of life? Is it working for us? And obviously, work being such a huge part of what we the time that we take during the week. It's an important question, and so I think a lot of people are questioning that. A lot of people in my network have moved around during that period, so there's a lot of shuffling of decks. So those were maybe people that were sort of looking for new meaning, new opportunities, but then there's a lot of people that are still kind of a bit more keen on sort of stability during that time, and just bunkered down in the roles that they were in those organizations. There's no right or wrong to that. It's just sort of an observation around, how people respond differently to change when it presents it to them. But seeing a lot of that great resignation, and I think it's I have heard it said by sort of other coaches and commentators around this, that many people sort of believe we're heading into sort of the roaring 20s, so you've got all this sort of chaos that's gone on after World War I, and not drawing historical parallels or anything like that, but in terms of, except at a high level, to say, we've had this massive change that sort of no one was necessarily expecting. It impacted us more than we thought, but there's great opportunity ahead. A lot of people are feeling that, but then there's also, it just depends on the story or the worldview you're coming from, right?
Yeah, no, I agree, mate. It's people will be writing books about this COVID impact on the world of work for decades to come, each with a slightly different view, and definitely some opportunities coming out of this. But I can understand too why some people have bunkered down as well. I get it. It makes for interesting discussions around the leadership topic as well as the communication topic, because again, like we said at the start of the discussion, there's some intricate links between different leader capabilities, and comms is always going to be in that mix to one degree or another. So, Joe, thank you for your time today, mate.
Pleasure. It's been fun. Thanks for having me, Eric.
Yeah. No worries. For those listening, I've been speaking to Joe Ringer. This is the Talking Leadership Podcast. Thanks for following and for supporting what I'm doing here. Be safe, and we'll catch you all on the next podcast.